Hey traders, let's jump into the world of arrays in PineScript. So first of all, what is an array? An array can be thought of as a collection of data types. So arrays can be used to store multiple values in one data structure or collection of data. Think of them as a better way to handle cases where you would otherwise need variables named, for example, price 0, price 1, price 2, and so on. Except that our list of variables in an array can be dynamically increased or decreased in size. So rather than having hard-coded variables for each value, you can have a list of values assigned to one array variable, and those values can change over time. The number of values saved can change over time, and they're just a more efficient way of handling cases where you need multiple forms of data saved under one collection. Now, arrays are an advanced feature used for scripts requiring intricate data handling. So if you are a beginner Pine programmer, you should become more familiar with other more accessible Pine features before you tackle arrays. That is why I've put this lesson towards the end of this course. They are not for the faint-hearted in terms of inexperienced programmers. Now, Pine arrays are one-dimensional, which means they look something like this. We have our array, and then our array has a list of values, and these are our values here, and it's one-dimensional. That's it. You can't have values within values and like stack values like this. That's not possible in arrays. We just have one list of data, and those values belong to our overall array. And we reference the values using what is called an index. So an index starts at 0 and extends to the number of elements in the array, -1. So if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements in our array here, X in this case would be array index 0, and the final array index would be 4. But because we start counting from 0, that means we have 5 different values stored in our array. Now, all elements of an array are of the same data type, which can be integer, whole numbers, floating point, decimal numbers, Boolean values, color, string, line, label, box, or tables. And they are always of series form, which means they can have different values across different bars on our chart. Arrays are referenced using an array ID, similar to line or label IDs. So for example, if we create an array here called A, and this is set to some code that creates an array. When we want to reference that array, we need to use the array dot control space will give us a list of functions that we can use to reference our array and manipulate that array. And we need to pass in our array ID, which is the name of the array variable. We'll get to this in a moment in the Pine editor, and this will make more sense. But if you're familiar with arrays in other languages, for example, Java, if you've ever used Java, an array in Java looks something like this. You have your array ID or variable name, and then you open square brackets and you reference your ID within those square brackets. And that gives you the array pretty much identically to how we reference close, open, high, close, and indicator values using the historical operator in PineScript. Other languages typically use that syntax for dealing with arrays. But in PineScript, things are a little bit different. We use this square bracket syntax for referencing series values, so open, high, low, close, volume, indicator values, etc. over historical data. And the number we put in here corresponds to the bar index on our chart. That is how arrays normally work in other languages, except that in PineScript, you cannot change the value of a series. So you can't change the value of the closing price from 10 bars ago by reassigning it to a different value. This is impossible in Pine. So instead, if you want to do something like this, if you want to deal with a collection of data and you want to manipulate that data, we need to use arrays to achieve that. And they behave a little bit differently. We use the get and set functions, for example, to read and write values of array elements. And array values can be used in all Pine expressions and functions where a value of series form is allowed. So a series form can just be thought of as open, high, low, close, values, volume, everything I just said, indicator values. Wherever you can use them in your script, you can use array values as well. Now, arrays in Pine can be sized dynamically, so that means the number of elements in the array can be modified on each bar on our script, and it can vary across bars. And multiple arrays can be used in the same script, and the maximum size of arrays, so the maximum amount of values you can store in an array, is 100,000 values, which is a lot of values. I don't think there will be many times, if ever, that you would run into that limitation. So let's explore how we declare arrays. So this is the syntax for declaring an array. We need to specify the type, and then we use the square brackets to indicate that this variable is not a normal variable, it's an array type. Then we have our identifier, which is our variable name, the name of the array or the array ID. Then we have our expression, which creates the array. So let's jump into the editor really quickly, and I'll show you an example of this. So for example, let's say we want to create an array that holds price values or indicator values, anything with a floating point number, a decimal number in it. The way we do that is, there are several ways we can do this, but let me show you one way. The first way we can do this is we can write out the data type that we want to work with. So in this case, that would be float. Then we need to put 2 square brackets at the end to signify that we want to create a float array. And then we need to specify a name for this array. So for this, we'll just call it price array. And then we need to initialize this as something. So to create a new array, there are a couple of ways we can do this. The first way is to just type out array, the array namespace, so array dot control space or command space. And there are 2 different types of functions we can create here, that we can use here to create an array. We can use from, so notice these data types down here. We can create an integer, float, bool, string, label, line, etc. using the from function. And then these arguments you see here, arg0, arg1, dot, dot, dot. We can specify the array values that we want in our array using this from function. This will create an array from the values we put in there. There's also the new function. So array.new underscore and then the data type. So we could create a new float array, and we can specify the size of the array and the initial value of every element within that array. But before we get to this, which is a little bit more complicated, let's just show you guys how to use the from. So if I write out from here, and we could say, let's specify our values as 0.1, 2.5, and let's go 5.0. Now when I save this code, this should compile without any problems. There we go. And now let's create a label that displays how many values are in our array. To do that, I'm going to create an if statement here, and I'm going to say if bar state.isLast. So if this is the last bar in our chart, then create a new label at the current bar index and place it at value 0. And the text will say array size is str.toString. Remember, we need to convert numbers to strings before we can add them to a string. So toString array dot control space size, and then we need to pass in the ID of our array, which is price array, the name of the variable. So here I can say price array, close those 2 parentheses off, and the third one. And now when I save my script, we should be getting 3 drawing onto the chart. There we go, because we have 1, 2, 3 elements in our array. If we want to display the first value in our array, then we need to use the str.toString function again, and then we need to use the array.get function to get the value we want from our array. So now for the array.get function, we need to pass in the array we want to reference, which is our price array again, and then the element index that we want to retrieve or get from our array. So remember, everything in programming starts from 0. So if we put 0 in here, we will be getting 0.1 drawing as our first value here. So if I save my script, bring this down a little, first value 0.1. If we want to get the last value, then we would need to pass in 0, 1, 2. So if I put 2 in here, that will reference the third value. Remember, counting from 0, 0, 1, 2, save my code, we'll get 5.0 or just 5 drawing on there. And I accidentally took out my new line escape character. There we go. So last value in our array is 5. So this is the basic core fundamentals of arrays. We create an array, we can get the size of our array here, which is useful for things like iterating through the array. It's called iteration when we loop through the values of an array, which I'll show you how to do in a future lesson. I don't think we'll cover that in this lesson. We'll keep it as simple as possible. This is just an introduction to arrays. Each lesson that I put in this section of the course will build on the previous. So for now, let's just keep it simple. We've created a very basic array here. We're getting the size of the array, and we're referencing values from the array. Let's say we want to change a value in the array. To do that, let's do it on the very last bar here as well. To change an array value, we can say array.control space, and we can use the set function. So I can say set price array, and then we need to specify the index of the values. So we're drawing the last value in our array here. Let's just reference that. So if I put 2 in there, we're now saying set the third value in our array to whatever we put in here next. So if I put 33 in here, when I save my script, I believe we'll get an error here because 33 is not a floating point number. There's no decimal here. This is an integer. So if I save my code, I believe we'll get an error. Oh no, PineScript converted that into a float. That's good. So now if we tried to create this as an int array and we passed in floating points, we'll definitely get an error here because declared type array is not compatible with the assigned type. So these types are floats, and we created an integer array. So floats are not compatible with integers, but apparently integers are compatible with floats, which is good. So if I change this back to float, PineScript is converting this whole number into 33.0. So now if I save the code, our last value here is 33 because we are overriding our last value by setting the value index of 2 on this price array to 33. And then when we draw that to the chart here and we get that same index value from our array, it's changed to 33. So that's how you create an array with predefined values. This is how you change a value in your array. And this is how you draw the value to the chart using a label. So let's look at some other examples here. Let me just quickly show you what happens when we use the new underscore float array function. So this will now create a new array with the specified size and the specified initial value. So let's create an array with the size of 1, for example, and the initial value of 0.0. When I save my code, we should be getting another error here because of the code down here is referencing the number 2 index, which is the third value in our array. And we just created an array with only 1 value in it. So if I save my code, yeah, we're getting an error up here and it should say array index out of bounds. There we go. Index 2 is out of bounds. Array size is 1. So now if I change my array size to 2, we'll still get an error because remember, the size of our array counts from 1. So if we put 1 in here, that means we have 1 value. If we put 2, that means we have 2. But our index starts from 0. So if we put 2 in here, we're actually referencing the third value in our array. So if I save my code, we should still get this error. We do. If we change our size to 3, now we have the same array size that we started with before when we created our array using the from function. So we have 3 possible values in our array. So now when I save the script, we should be getting 33 drawing back onto our chart because of our set function is overriding the third value. So let me save my script. There we go. We have 33 drawing as our last value. If I remove this array.set code and save my code, now the last value is 0 because of this. When we use the array.new function for any of our data types, the initial value is assigned to every element in our array. So if I change this to 2.5, for example, save my code, this will now say 2.5 is the last value. And every value in our array is 2.5 by default until we override that. So now it's important to mention that arrays behave identically to other variables in terms of how the PineScript engine handles them. What I mean by that is when we create this variable, this array variable, it is recreated on every single bar on our chart the same way any other indicator value would be. So what I mean by that is if I create a new variable here called my variable and I set it to 0 and we plot my variable, and then when I save my code, we should be getting 0 drawing on every single bar in our chart. And if I were to increment my variable by 1 on every bar on my chart, this will now plot 1 on every bar. So when I save my code, now every bar says 1. That's because this my variable is recreated on every new bar that gets loaded onto our chart. If I turn this into a VAR variable, however, and I save my code, now we'll be plotting how many bars were plotted onto our chart, because my variable gets incremented on every historical bar that our script runs on. And because we use the VAR keyword, this variable value does not get reset on every new bar, and it persists across all of our price action. We can use the same technique with our arrays. So for example, let's do the same thing with our array. Let's count how many bars are on our chart. To do that, I'll get rid of this code and get rid of this commented code. And let's create a new array called VAR count array is set to array.new_float, and we'll give it an initial size of 0. Let me copy this into our array variables here, and we'll come back to this in a moment. But for now, I'll set this to the first value in our array. Now, the way we add a value to an existing array is using the push function. So array.push will append or add whatever value we put into this function to the given array. So if I put in count array here, and then let's just push the current closing price of every bar on our chart to this array. So now when I save my code, we should be getting an array size of, 4,149, which is how many bars were on our chart. And you can see the first value here is 0.04951. I'm sure we'd all love to have bought Bitcoin back when it was worth 5 cents. Let's go back and check that out and make sure that's an accurate number. And indeed it is. Back in July of 2010, Bitcoin was worth 5 cents. How things have changed since then, eh? And we have our array size of 4,149. Let's get rid of our first value here and say bar count. And then we'll add str.toString, the bar index value, to our label. Save our code. And now you can see that our bar count is 4,148. That's because our bar count begins counting from 0. So this is technically 4,149, but our array size counts our 0 index as 1. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing. When you are referencing your array values, it starts from 0, but your array size includes the element at array 0 as 1. So if you've got an array values in it, the array size is 3, but to reference the third value, you need to put in the index of 2. So I know it gets quite confusing. Don't worry, with practice, you'll get the hang of this. So let me change this back to 0, and let's say we want to reference the last bar value. So if I change this to last value in our array, and we use the array.get function, we pass in our count array, and then we now want to reference the final value in our array. The way we can do that is using the array size counter function and then subtracting 1 from that. So if I cut this out, and we'll just create a new variable here called size, paste that in. So now we're creating a new variable called size, which is assigned to array.size, and then we pass in our array ID. This size value will now be 4149. So if we want to reference the last value in our array using the array.get function, we need to pass in size minus 1. And I'll show you why we need to subtract 1 from our size. If I get rid of that and I save my script, we'll get an error, array index out of bounds, because 4149 is exactly the same index as our array size. But remember, our array values start from 0, so we need to subtract 1 from this to get the final value in our array. So now when I save the code, we should be getting the current closing price. So save, and there it is, 50319. And it's changing as price action changes. So I think that will do it for the introduction to arrays. In future lessons, we'll build on this information and try different techniques for dealing with arrays. To be perfectly honest with you, I personally have never used arrays in my scripts. I've never really encountered a situation where I needed to. It's a feature in PineScript that, due to the nature of PineScript, isn't as commonly used as it would be in other programming languages, but nonetheless we'll explore this further in the lessons to come. So I'll see you there.